In this episode of Inspire, we are introducing a road network to the industrial part of the world, and that's not it. We are also going to be introducing a rail network, which does indeed mean trains, and lots of them, at least in the future. Trains probably take a while to build. I don't know, I've never built one before. But we are gonna learn in this world. It's all about learning new tips and tricks in building and just becoming better builders overall. Now, I've never played around with trains before in Minecraft, or really anything of that sort. I've done a little bit of work with some roads and some vehicles and things like that. Not at a very big scale, at a pretty small one, but I've got a little bit of experience there. So I'm feeling a little more confident on the road side of things, but I think the trains and railroads and all of that are going to introduce a really, really fun opportunity to learn a little bit more about builds that kind of follow the more modern sort of umbrella, I guess, or more of the industrial theme within Minecraft, something that I definitely have a long ways to go with in terms of learning how to build and techniques and all of that kind of stuff. It's very foreign to me. So in this episode, we are going to have our hand at it, and before we go any further, in the opening sequence of the video, you guys saw all of the terraforming, for the most part, that was needed to get this hill expanded and ready to go. And I know what you're thinking, but no, the hollow terrain isn't real. The hollow terrain can't hurt you. It'll all be covered up by the end of it, so don't worry, you won't see it for very long, and there's no way I'm filling it all in solid. But regardless, in the industrial area of the world, in the previous episodes, if you've caught them, you will know that our goal here is to create an aesthetic build and cover for every one of our farms or efficient contraptions that we utilize in this world. So far, we have the big orange factory right here covering our moss farm, and we've got our little substation over there covering our sheep farm. The one exception would be our creeper farm and sugarcane farm, which we have way off in the medieval part of the world, in which we built the entire spire around it and everything like that. But over here in the industrial area, we're gonna have a huge majority of all of our redstone and gameplay efficiency type of builds, and we're going to build up aesthetic things around all of them. So in that category, even though it's not entirely redstone, we have a lot of villagers, and they are temporarily sitting right down here at the moment with all of their jobs, and they're in minecarts and ready to be moved, and they have been waiting for quite a while down in this hole. It is time to get these guys out of the hole. So today we are building a train station right back here where I've been doing some terraforming. And the idea is that we can use the train station as our build for our villager trading hall, at least of sorts. Now, how we're going to introduce the villagers into this build, or at least how we're going to incorporate them into a train station, we're gonna have two separate buildings. We're gonna have one half of the train station dedicated to passenger trains and people who are taking the train to and from, and we're going to have the other half of the train station based on the more industrial side of things. It's going to be for cargo trains, it's going to be for deliveries, for drop-offs and pickups and all of that kind of stuff, and that'll be on the back half of it over here, and that's going to be a big part of what kind of blends it in with the industrial part of the world. We can kind of look at it like the passenger side is for employees who are working in this area of the industrial district, maybe this big factory, maybe some other things that we're going to build around here. And then, of course, the industrial side, it just kind of speaks for itself, given we're in the industrial area and there's some factories around here. The villagers are going to be included in both sides of this train station. In the passenger side, we're going to have the villagers act as though they are the employees of the train station. We're going to have a big, long counter at the back of it, and that might be where you go as a citizen to buy a train ticket, or maybe file a complaint if you had a bad time on the train, or anything like that, just like the employees who are just kind of working behind the counter. We're going to have a bunch of villagers in the passenger side of the station doing that. In the other side of the station, over on the cargo end, we are going to have villagers that are going to be more so underground and kind of hidden away. Over there, it's going to be a lot more utility and a lot less kind of perfect blend of aesthetic with the use that we have, like on the passenger side. And what I mean by that is just that we're not going to put as much effort on the cargo side with the villagers as we do on the passenger side. On the passenger side, they're going to be a part of the build. They're going to be included in a way that feels natural and brings the world to life in a lot of ways. And then over on the cargo side, I'm just going to throw them underground, and there'll just be like a staircase from that building, and maybe we'll dress up the basement, but it'll just be like way more utility, because that's probably where I'm going to put most of them. But at least some of them will kind of be a part of the build and look good, right? Listen, there's a lot of villagers that we need in a villager trading hall, and I can only do so much in the build, so most of them are going underground, and that will be fine. The goal is, at the end of the day, that all of our utility things in this world are covered up with a build, and the train station will indeed be covering up all of our villagers. And not to mention, we're going to need some automated farms working underground as well, things like melons and pumpkins to trade for emeralds, and maybe some farms for all of the other crops as well, just so we have a supply somewhere, because I definitely cannot get enough wheat, and I would love to have that automated for packing some mud. I've been using so much mud in this world, and it's kind of tedious to get all that wheat by hand, which I have been doing up to this point. And speaking of packed mud, I want to go over some of the pallet that we're going to be using for the train station. So I mentioned it's going to consist of 2 different buildings, and we're going to do them pretty similarly. This right here is going to be the main look, at least on the exterior. We're going to use this brown pallet consisting of packed mud bricks, and brown mushroom, but the fun part is going to come in the form of wall blocks. So for much of the exterior, we are going to be using mud brick walls. It's really unfortunate that we don't have wall versions of regular packed mud or really anything else in this color range. So it'll just be the packed mud bricks that we'll have to do. I think we can come up with a fun way to detail it, even though there's a lot of the mud brick texture that we're going to be seeing in the form of that being the only wall that we can use to kind of create this depth. One of the things we're going to do is involve these 3 blocks every so often. It's going to be these little splotches of kind of weathered and worn down parts of the building. Using light gray terracotta, dripstone blocks, and this weathered or exposed rather copper block right here in tandem, every so often, not that much at all, just little patches of it here and there, can kind of do a little bit of what we've seen in the Orange Factory, where we get these little weathered areas, these little patches that just kind of show the age of the building, the wear and tear over the years. And while that building has quite a lot of it, we're not going to have as much in the train stations, and a part of that is just that the buildings are much smaller than that big factory. But nonetheless, I think it will do a lot to kind of help supplement the build and add that extra little detail to catch your eye. Up top on the roof, we're going to be using these 2 blocks, or I guess 3 right here. We're going to be using this polished tuff to just accent the edges of it, and then the majority of the roof is going to be deep slate between these 2 versions right here, bricks and polished deep slate as well, just kind of in a random pattern of sorts to get that darker color and kind of help contrast that brown. One of the biggest things that we're going to be doing in this build is not using overhangs or ledges. I've set up the pallet right here with a little overhang, but once we actually get the buildings in place, I'm going to try building the roof flush with the edges of the building. That's something that I am scared to do in any build I ever do, and I always lean on doing these overhangs because I love building with depth, but I think you can learn a lot from trying to avoid that and trying to intentionally do some of the harder things. You can kind of teach yourself some more tricks and some more ways to make it work in case you're ever in a situation where it might work as a little bit of a better solution and you don't find yourself going back to old habits and never thinking outside the box. So I'm excited to see how that turns out in the build. I think I've got an idea as to what we can do to make it look good and make it work with our 2 buildings. Over here, we've got the floor palette for the interior. Now, this is a really common block palette with one change to it. Normally, you would use normal granite to go with bricks and terracotta, and that's usually the palette that I think everyone who's played Minecraft has used at one point or another, and there's good reason for that. It is one of the best block palettes in the game. We are going to change it up, however, for the train station and use polished granite. The reason that we're using polished granite instead of regular is that I want the insides of the train station to feel a little bit more high quality. I want it to feel like it's of better construction, and I feel like the normal palette with the regular granite works a little bit more for outdoor areas or exterior builds, whereas we're kind of doing the inside of a nicer building of a business, and therefore I feel like that one little change right there can just kind of help take it to that next level and make it fit in a little bit better. And the reason I went with this palette for the floor is I think it works really well with the brown that we're using for the wall, and even the kind of weathered accent patches that we're going to have with those 3 blocks right there. It's just 1 or 2 hue shifts over. It's pretty close, but enough that it's still different, and once we get the building in place and we see the floor with the brown walls around the outside, it creates a pretty good look, I think, that isn't too contrasty, but is still different from the walls and even the ceilings, which we'll be incorporating a little bit more tuff in and some deep slate as well, and that's where we kind of get our pop of contrast. With the palette decided, There is, of course, one glaring issue. We want to build a train station, but there's nowhere for trains to even go. We gotta lay some tracks for the trains to occupy, and I think that would be a really good base to start with so that we can build everything else around it. That is the focus of the build, after all. Hey, if you're watching this video, there's a good chance that you're not already subscribed. If you like what we're doing in this series and want to see more of it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. It lets me know what you want to see more of. Now, I think we're a little bit more ready to put the train station together. So again, like I've mentioned in the episode a little bit earlier, we have 2 tracks, and each one of these tracks serves a different purpose. This one on the far side from the factory and the electrical substation is going to be for the cargo trains. We're going to have our little cargo kind of a train station building over here, and then we're going to have a little road on the other side for some trucks, utility vehicles, all of that kind of stuff, right? And then on the closer track over here, right next to the factory and right next to where we're going to put a road, this will be our passenger side because, of course, it is closer to the road and other buildings and parking lot and all of that kind of stuff. So it just kind of works out well that way. One thing we are going to do with the buildings is that they are going to be kind of mirrors of one another and just have some slight tweaks for their various purposes, of course, being passenger side and cargo side. But for the most part, on the exterior, the 2 buildings are going to be identical to make up the train station, kind of 2 halves of one whole, if you will. And I think one of the fun parts of it is that we have the tracks coming down the middle of it, and it's not like everything's on one side of it. You kind of loop the trains and the railroad into the build in a way by having it shoot through the middle of it and then having either building on either side. I think it'll create a pretty cool effect for our first train station here. And yes, first train station. This one won't be the only one we do, and we'll probably end up at some point doing a really fancy kind of main grand train station at some point. That's a lot bigger and a lot cooler, but this will get us started because I feel like before we're ready to build a really big one and a really fancy one, we need to actually have a proper rail network going on in the world. Speaking of having a rail network go around the world, after and a little bit before even it gets to this train station right here, these 2 tracks are going to kind of separate from one another. I think there will be times where they kind of come together like at this train station right here, but I think we'll have the 2 separate lines going. I think for one, the passenger train will probably have more of an emphasis on having some cool views and going over bridges and things like that. And then the cargo train, when it's doing its thing, might be a little bit less aesthetic and a little bit more kind of going through tunnels and just kind of taking utility routes and that kind of thing. I think it could create a pretty interesting dynamic and also have 2 different rail lines going throughout the industrial district rather than just 2 of them that are basically one because they're sandwiched together. Eventually, not in this episode, but in the future, we're going to continue these tracks down this way, and then we are going to loop them to the left. So of course, if you remember, we have 3 different areas of the world. We've got our fantasy area over here, and that's pretty much divided by this body of water right here from our industrial area, which we are just at the very edge of starting out up on this hill. The third area is way off in the distance and doesn't really interact with the industrial district until you get much farther that way, so we don't really have to worry about that for now. But one thing that we do have to keep in mind is that the tracks are going to meander to the left, either at the very edge of this hill or down next to the water, either one. We'll figure it out when the time comes, but those are going to curve that way, and then off in that direction, we begin to have a little bit more freedom where we can kind of go that way a little bit, and then we have all of the space off in that direction to take the tracks wherever we see fit. So I think the next step from here is going to be to get the train platforms built, and we're going to do that on either side, of course, one for each building. The passenger side, I think we are going to set further down in this direction, kind of towards the... where's the sun? kind of towards the eastern part of the track right there, and then on the cargo side, we'll offset it by putting it a little bit further towards the west. And the reason that we're going to offset the buildings and the platforms themselves is because we're already mirroring the exterior for the most part. It's going to be two identical buildings, and so to prevent it from feeling like it's too much of a copy paste from one side to the other and too much mirroring going on, I feel like if we offset them a little bit, one further that way, one further this way, we can kind of add that little variation, that little change up into the picture right here, something that you might not even notice, but it's more of a subconscious detail that separates the two sides just enough while the aesthetic of the two remains mostly the same. So let's get these platforms built, and then we can talk about what we want to do with the two buildings. And just like that, platforms in place. All right, so platforms have been constructed, and this is actually a really good way that I can kind of show you what I was talking about with the varied buildings. So because they're going to be so similar on the outside, we're just going to shuffle them along the track slightly differently so we get that little bit of variation. We're going to have the edge of this building, the cargo one right here, and it's going to be, I don't know, 10, 12 blocks, whatever that comes out to the platform for the other building, and the actual building won't even start until you get about right here, and that'll be more in line with the factory. But by kind of offsetting these a little bit, we'll create a really interesting look amongst the two buildings, being they're so similar, and we don't want it to be too much of the same. So one of the things that you'll notice with the platforms is that on the cargo side, we have it wrap around the side and then the back of the building as well. And I mentioned it just briefly earlier, but I have this little grass kind of slope right here, and this is going to turn into a little driveway of sorts, a road for delivery trucks to kind of get up to the back of this building and either drop things off or pick things up to then be carried off by road, things that will interact with the cargo trains that come through here. Now, we only have the platform come around the backside of the cargo building because over on the passenger side, right at the edge of the platform over there, it's going to turn into sidewalk for the street that we're going to have past between the factory and the passenger side of the train station here. We're going to have a street out there, we're going to have a big sidewalk, and that's just going to kind of naturally blend in with everything else going on. And to even add on to that, we're going to add a small parking lot to this side of the building over here, stretching from about the end of the platform all the way over to where we have the villagers underground currently, and of course we will have to get those guys moved once we have buildings to put them in. Now, before we get either of the buildings in place for our train station over here, I think it's important for us to lay out our roads and the parking lot and then the truck delivery area and the backside over there as well. I think having all of the roads in place, much like we did with having the rail in place, will just kind of help make the building feel more a part of the area and more embedded in what's going on around here, as opposed to if we just built the buildings up first and then started to lay some roads around there. It's not the biggest deal in the world, but I think it's just one of those little things as we watch the build come together. I think the roads coming in first will be good, and we can cap everything off with the buildings. Now we are ready to build the buildings. I wanted to save those for last because that's where we're going to be putting all of our villagers inside of. But before we actually get started on that, let's talk a little bit about what I've built. So as you can see right here, we've introduced our first little stretch of road. It's nothing crazy. It's really simple as it stretches down over here. And I do think that eventually we are going to build a parking lot here in between the factory and that electrical substation. I think at some point we'll come back through here. I'll probably tear up the sidewalk a little bit, and we'll kind of angle the road so that it kind of just hits a dead end, maybe a little cul-de-sac or something like that, and then we have our parking lot. And the road, for the most part, will just continue off that way, more towards the rest of the industrial district. Besides that, I've got our first little parking lot right here. It's very simple, and I need to finish it once we move the villagers. I actually couldn't put anything there because the villagers are in the way in that little hill. So once I do that, I'll be able to finish off that last 2 blocks of the parking lot right there. But I wanted to do something that was pretty simple. We even have it handicap accessible right there. We added this little walkway up into one of the side doors right here, and then, of course, we have the sidewalks next to the street that stretch all the rest of the plot. And much like with everything else, everything that you see just kind of getting cut off will eventually expand into the rest of the industrial district of the world, off in that direction as we build it up over time. Over on the backside, you can see some of the pavement that we've put over there as well for some of the delivery vehicles that will be coming to and from the cargo side of the train station. Over on the far side, we've got a little slope where the road just kind of dips down and then hits a part right next to the water. And as a matter of fact, if we come all the way over here, you can actually see that slope. We've got some retaining walls going on the side right here. This part for the platform that wraps all the way around the building and next to the railroad over there. And then, of course, the plot with the building right here. I tried to leave enough space with the road right here for delivery trucks, whether that's box trucks or semi-trucks or what have you, to at least have some maneuvering room. I tried to build it in a way that it would make sense and in a way that felt like things were possible, but also not too open and spacious, because as you can see, we are floating over the hill right here. The plot is not quite big enough on top of the hill to support all of this. And that does bring me to my next point. We have this huge lake right here, and we have a huge kind of river that kind of forms this little lake over on this side as well. And this happens to be right at the threshold between the fantasy part of the world over yonder and the industrial part of the world that starts right here. Now, I think long term, what I want to do is I want to dig out all of this land in between and connect these bodies of water into what will either be a pretty big lake all around or just a really, really wide river. And if we do it wide enough, it could be a big enough river to support cargo ships and that sort of thing that we can actually potentially build a little mini port for at the bottom of this road down here, this road that all the cargo trucks are using to get up to and from the railway station on top of the hill. I'm thinking maybe not like huge container ships that go through the ocean, but some kind of smaller cargo vessels that we can travel by water as well. And that will turn this into a hub, not only where a road meets, but the railroad meets and also the water meets as well, for this kind of trifecta right on the edge of our industrial area. And that will also set us up for other areas in the rest of the industrial district as well to do other forms of water cargo, of course, train cargo, with this train station kind of setting the foundation for that. And then, of course, the road network as well. With those plans laid out, I do think we are finally ready to build the buildings of the train station, the main piece to this plot right here. Before we do that, however, we have to turn our attention to the Patreon forest behind me off in the yonder distance. We've got another tree to build. And now, finally, let's get these 2 buildings going. We've got the passenger building on this side, and we've got the cargo building on the other side. And again, they're going to be pretty similar aesthetically, and the insides are going to have a little bit different functionality. But once we get these 2 buildings up to make our train station, I'll be able to start moving the villagers in, and we'll have a proper setup for our villagers in this world. The vision is starting to come together. Now, this has taken quite a long time, so I don't think we're going to have to worry about moving all of the villagers in on this episode. However, I'm really happy that we got both of these buildings in place, the passenger side and the cargo side of our train station. So let's take a closer look at what we've done. So if you come down through the parking lot over here and through the bollards and into the passenger side of the building, we've got our interior in place, and I went for something that could work a little bit aesthetically and quite a bit functionally, given this is, of course, our villager focused build of the industrial area. So for the most part in this area, we've got all of these seats, we've got these benches, these chairs, what have you. The idea is it's the passenger side of the station. So over on the far wall, we might have like the ticket booth, I guess, or whatever you might call it. This is where you're going to get your train tickets. You're going to figure out where you're going, what trains come at what times, all of that kind of stuff. We have these little line dividers, and you would imagine that they would probably need a lot of seating in here for people waiting for their trains to arrive, especially if they don't want to wait outside. Now, behind the counter here on either side, we've split these all up using these fence gates, both because they do look good in this case, of course, but also because we want to put villagers in each of these areas. So each of these little pockets behind the counter will have a villager, and I've yet to figure out which villagers we're going to put in this building specifically, but I feel like the librarians kind of make the most sense for kind of, you know, the ticket area of the train station. So it could very well be villagers. Maybe we'll decide something else. The good news is we don't have to worry about that quite yet, but this will be the first little bit of villagers that we see come into the build, and that'll be over on the passenger side. Something I had to do with the windows is find a way to kind of make them work on the inside. We use this technique that I used over in the orange factory, and if you remember that as well, we double layer glass panes. So if I come outside, you can kind of see it a little bit better, right? But we're using this technique to kind of make glass panes but smaller, right? We're turning one glass pane into two in each of the areas in which it happens, in which we overlay kind of two layers of glass panes, right? And technically, we have more normal glass panes behind the wall here around the edges, except for up top. And the reason I did that was I kind of wanted to give the windows this little bit of a curved or arched top sort of a look to it. And you gotta kind of get creative. You gotta use your imagination because the actual mud doesn't do that. It's pretty rectangular, but if you look at it from far away and you get the right view of the glass panes themselves, the more prominent ones, which are of course the regular ones, it almost looks like we have this curve in the windows. That's what I was trying to replicate there, and it kind of works. It's not the worst thing ever, so I went ahead and kept it in there. But we have this kind of double glass pane look to it everywhere, which just kind of shrinks the windows down that ever little bit. Instead of having big glass panes and what might turn out to be, you know, 6 in a window, all of a sudden we get double that, right? And we have smaller glass panes, and it just kind of works to make the build feel a little bit more modern and a little bit less Minecrafty, I guess, if that makes sense. I mean, of course, it's all Minecrafty. We're in Minecraft, but anything you could do to try and make a build feel a little bit less like a Minecraft build and a little bit more like what it's trying to be. I don't know if that makes sense. Anyway, that's something I keep in mind. I think the windows really do that. On the inside, I added these dark oak trapdoors around the tops and the bottoms of them, just to kind of add these little accents or these little kind of windowsills, I guess, something to make it feel a little bit more a part of the build on the inside, because without them, the double layered windows just look so out of place. So I hope it helps. It does add a little bit of contrast with that dark oak color around the walls, which I do like, and that's a theme that you'll see occur in the other building as well. Speaking of the other building, we're over here on the cargo side, and before we go in, I want to show the back side of our passenger side of the building. We have this little overhang right here next to the doors in case it's raining or anything like that. Just a little spot right there. A couple more benches on the outside, and then we of course have these light posts dotted along the platform on either side of the station as well for when it's a little bit dark out. So if we come down here on the cargo side of our train station, we have these cargo doors right here, or garage doors, and I kind of went about it in a pretty dynamic way. I wanted some of them closed, some of them open, some of them kind of somewhere in between, and I went as far as to do up all of these chains and try to represent these little garage door openers that can kind of work to operate these doors, or maybe just chains that you pull on, you know, as an employee here or whatever it might be. In the middle, we have this little transfer area. The idea was that it was kind of like a conveyor belt, or at least something that you could kind of, you know, meander a big cargo container across. So for example, if we have like a cargo train here and you need to transfer it to a semi truck, or you have a truck out back and you need to transfer it onto the train. This might be the door right here in the middle where you can kind of push it along. We have these like little rollers, was kind of what I was going for with the anvil. Again, you got to use your imagination a little bit, but I do think it works pretty well. So we have this little cargo container. This might be where it hooks up to like the back of a semi-truck if it's on the trailer. It's got some graffiti on it on both sides. Tried everything we could to kind of make it feel like it is one of those cargo containers, and I think we did a pretty decent job. We'll definitely see more of these be built and come to life down next to the water once we really focus on that part of the area, but that will itself be its own episode. In the rest of the building, we did a bunch of shelves over here, something simple, just using bamboo trapdoors and scaffolding to kind of create this industrial shelf sort of look to it, and I could have filled it up with some chests and barrels and everything, but I felt like the empty shelves kind of spoke enough or really presented itself well enough that we didn't really need to fill it in, especially given over here on the other side we do have a bunch of storage. We have these big crates full of smaller crates, at least was the idea that I was going for. Lots of these bee nests or beehives or whichever one the fancy looking ones are with signs around them, just as another crate, you know, along with the usual note blocks and then the obvious choices of chests and barrels. The more variation we can get in there, the better, and the more we're able to kind of bring it to life. And right here, finally on the inside of the cargo area, this is where we are going to be shifting our focus next in the following episode. This is where we're going to put the majority of our villagers, as well as some of the automated villager farms. I'm thinking like a wheat farm, a potato farm, a carrot farm, all of the food that villagers can farm, as well as an automated melon and pumpkin system. I do think melons and pumpkins are going to be the way we get emeralds going forward for any of the trades we need, whether that's with librarians, whether that's with stonemasons for all of the things they do, or what have you, anything villager related. I think melons and pumpkins are going to be the way to go. So all of that's going to take place underneath, and because the train station build here is definitely like an aesthetic first, function second sort of a project, there was no way I was going to fit all of this inside either of the buildings or both of them combined. The best thing we could do is do a little bit in one of the buildings and really lean into the aesthetic part of this build, and then start putting the rest of them underground in some sort of basement or just underneath the build utility area, much like in the Moss Farm Factory, for example. You just enter the door and it's not at all aesthetic, it's just all utility in there. It's big empty space with a big farm in the middle that I have room to expand as well. It's really no different here. We're just kind of going underneath the build. Getting those villagers in underneath will be making a huge difference. I'm actually down to like my last 6 golden carrots or something like that, so I really need to get on that pretty quick. I'm running out of food, and of course we could use the wheat farm for all of the mud that we need to pack. I have used so much mud in this world, and there's so much more to come. Now, one thing I did mention, of course, was the water on the back side of the build, and I know I mentioned this earlier in the episode as well, some of the potential future plans to connect the water and kind of create a little harbor down here. And I don't know when exactly we'll get to that, but one thing I do know that I want to do in the next episode, along with working on getting the villagers in place, is a little bit of terraforming back here as well. We're going to do some combination of retaining walls on this far side, similar to what we did over here, right next to where we have the platform for the building. We'll do a mix of terraforming and retaining walls. It's not going to terraform all the way down like one big gradual hill, but it's also not going to be purely retaining wall just going all the way down in the terrain. We're gonna probably find a balance there. And another thing we may do is build out this parking lot for what will be kind of a harbor area. That's something that I think we will try to work on as well, right where I kind of left it off in that little spot right there. Just some brainstorming, some things that I think we could do in the following episode to try and finish out this area, along with, of course, finishing out the function and the utility, which is, of course, centered around all of those villagers that we have in the hole. And who knows, that might not be the only thing that we do in the next episode. As a matter of fact, at some point, we are going to need actual trains and actual vehicles to take up the rails and the roads that we're building in this area. But we'll have to see what we get up to in the next episode. This one has taken long enough to put together, so I want to get this one out to you guys as fast as I can. So I think we've accomplished a pretty good amount in this episode. As always, shout out to everyone who supports the content on a Patreon. If your name's on screen, it's thanks to you that I get to do all of this and keep pumping out these episodes. Don't forget, if you want to join this list of names, you can join the Patreon as well. Links in the description, and you get a custom tree like we had in this episode, and I believe the last as well. Beyond that, as always, I hope you guys enjoyed the episode, and I hope you guys left today feeling just a little bit inspired.